Hello, Texas, and welcome to a candid conversation about what powers modern life. If you're looking for facts about our energy landscape and how oil and natural gas provides energy security for our state, nation, and allies around the globe, you've come to the right place. This is TXOGA Talks, where energy meets insight. Welcome back to TXOGA Talks, a podcast brought to you by the Texas Oil and Gas Association. We often go by the acronym TXOGA. I'm Todd Staples. I'm delighted to be your host today, and I'm so glad that you're joining us for a very great conversation today. And I just want to remind us, whether you live in the middle of the oil patch or in one of our fast-growing cities, there is no denying that energy is the lifeblood of the Texas economy. And I can say this with confidence because in fiscal year 2025 alone, our industry paid a record $27 billion in state and local taxes and state royalties. Folks, that $27 billion exceeds the general tax revenue of 34 states. There's state after state that would love to trade places with Texas, and the reason why is because that money directly funds our schools, it funds our roads, it funds our first responders. And on top of all of that, we have about 500,000 Texans, almost 500,000, working directly in oil and gas jobs. And so when I look at today's oil and natural gas companies, I think of them as science and technology companies. And today we're talking about a technology that is poised to anchor a $1 trillion global industry, carbon capture and storage, or I might refer to that as CCS. And to help with this conversation, I'm very excited today to have a very special guest with us who is an expert. He has worked at over 50 geological basins across 5 continents. He spent more than 15 years as a global exploration geologist with BP before bringing his expertise to the Gulf Coast Carbon Center at UT Austin's Bureau of Economic Geology, or BEG. We work with that group quite often. Dr. Alex Bump, welcome to the show today.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. I appreciate that.
We're certainly glad to have you with us today, and the work at BEG and the work that you're doing at the Gulf Coast Carbon Center certainly is adding a lot to the state's economy. And so we look forward to having this conversation today. And I really want to start with your background, Alex. You spent a large chunk of your career in oil and gas exploration. I think before the show, we talked to you, grew up in Vermont. Vermont would be a great place to be right now. I wonder you don't know what the temperature is in Vermont roughly this time of year, do you?
I can tell you today, my mom texted me this morning to say that it was 70 degrees high expected for the day. She was sitting on her porch listening to the rain.
Well, good for her. That sounds wonderful. I tell you, we should be in Vermont with your mom right now on her porch doing this show. We need to plan that.
Next time, right?
Next time. You spent a large chunk of your career in oil and gas exploration, literally hunting for the very products that powers modern life today. Things, extracting these hydrocarbons from below the surface. So I'm just wondering what prompted you to turn your attention 180 degrees from pulling hydrocarbons out of the ground and now focusing on putting carbon back underground.
Fair question. It seems a bit contradictory, doesn't it? And in many ways, it actually is pretty much the same thing with different goals, both subsurface. And I'll give you a better answer to it. I got into petroleum because A, I'm a geologist, and post-graduation, I needed a job. Fair enough, right? But I stayed for almost 20 years because the science was fascinating, the people were amazing, and there was a lot of satisfaction in bringing heat, light, mobility, economic development to the world. So I left BP 2018 without really knowing what was next. I spent a year traveling the world with my family and exploring what one might do with expertise in subsurface geology. And along the way, I discovered CCS, which was new and eye-opening because it was a chance to put those subsurface skills to work on something brand new, effectively, exploring a new industry. I used to describe my job in oil and gas as using geologic insight to create opportunity, right? Opportunities for people, opportunities for the company, opportunities even for the planet. And I still do that. It's just a different industry. I love them both. I wouldn't trade a minute of either one. So it's really fun to wear both hats in this conversation.
Well, I know that your background brings a wealth of experience that informs your opinions and gives you a lot of credibility because you've been involved in the different spaces, and I'm grateful to spend a little bit of time with you today. It's interesting you grew up on the farm and talk about environmental stewardship. I was fortunate and blessed to serve 2 terms as the elected Texas Agriculture Commissioner of this great state. Uh, Landowners, farmers, and ranchers know that they must care for the land in order for it to produce for them. And I see that same sense of dedication and responsibility in oil and gas and industrial manufacturing. And regardless of your thoughts on carbon emissions and if that's a priority for you or not, the thing that I look at, Alex, is, as Ag Commissioner, we regulated the organics agricultural products and certified our farmers as organic products. And so there were protocols that we implemented. I've got to tell you, I believe in traditional agriculture. I think that it does a fantastic job of meeting consumers' needs, but I recognize that we've got some excellent farmers and ranchers in Texas that have an affinity to provide organic products for consumers that is a priority for them. And I thought it was my job to be the regulator that made that work, even if that product was not necessarily a priority for me. I think of consumers as king, and I think of the industry needing to respond to what consumers are asking for. Is that a fair analogy in looking at what companies are doing today and responding and providing CCS for consumers and for other businesses that see that as a priority for them?
There are certainly parallels. There are a range of opinions, just as you point out with food consumption, and range of opinions about what people want. The market makes available a range of options, and CCS as a business will live or die on the business case. So, the other thing about that you mentioned is just the tastes evolve, times evolve as well, and scales evolve. Times change, and consumer change, public sentiment changes along with it. So this is an option, effectively.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I want today to really get into really what is CCS. I think that there's a lot of lack of information. I really, it's not an issue that I paid attention to until a few years ago. And so I like to think about that. And when we talk about carbon capture technology, my understanding is it's about filtering out carbon dioxide or CO2 from industrial emissions like manufacturing plants, power generation sites, before they ever enter the atmosphere in some cases. In other cases, it may be emissions that are already in the air that can be removed through direct air capture. And so, Alex, can you just kind of walk our listeners a bit through what happens after CO2 is captured?
So you're spot on. We can apply this to just about any source of CO2. And the capture process is basically chemical engineering. We then dry the CO2, compress it, put it into a pipeline for transport to a storage site, where we inject it in deep wells to store it as a dense fluid, which was thousands of feet below the surface. In carefully selected geologic formations. I'll talk your ear off about this. So let me stop it there. You can ask further questions as you need to.
No, that's good. I like that. So it's a liquid form when the CO2 is injected. So it's a liquid form when it goes through a pipeline after it's captured. Is that
That's correct.
okay? Okay, good. So
Dense phase liquid.
is this a new technology? Is this something that was just discovered recently, or kind of walk us through that?
Not at all is the short answer. The first capture and, in fact, subsurface injection was in West Texas in 1972. So a bit over 50 years ago, and it was done for enhanced oil recovery. Uh, that industry has absolutely pioneered handling of CO2 and subsurface injection of it. To date, we've injected about 1 billion tons of CO2, right? Um, there's a lot of experience here, and it's mostly CO2 EOR because that's where the business case has been. But there's also a wide range of experimental and pilot projects that are aimed at pure storage, just getting rid of CO2. Even some niche commercial projects. And of course, there is a new wave of dedicated capture and storage projects, and perhaps a new wave of CO2 EOR projects, all of which store significant amounts of CO2.
Well, they say it ain't bragging if it's true, and you just pointed out something that I didn't realize, that carbon capture first started in West Texas. The heartbeat, the global focal point of oil and gas production is the Permian Basin today, and it started because of a business case. Is kind of what we started this conversation out with today, for enhanced oil recovery. And folks, for those of you that are listening that may not be immersed in oil and gas, can you just give a brief definition of what enhanced oil recovery means, Alex?
Sure. So you could think of this a little bit like draining water out of a sponge. So primary oil recovery, stick a straw in the sponge and some of the water will flow out, right? That's a primary recovery. If you want to get more out of it, we typically start injecting water into oil reservoirs to push more oil out. And maybe this is equivalent to sort of blowing on the side of the sponge, blowing air at it. Enhanced is the next step. And in enhanced oil recovery, we inject CO2 or we inject other fluids into the reservoir to help wash the oil out. So it's what we call a tertiary recovery technique. In sponge terms, it's sort of like squeezing the sponge.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's good. Thank you for walking us through that, because water is a serious issue in Texas right now. I mean, Corpus Christi's out of water. South Texas is tough. They're all trying to think of desalination and other ways, and so it's great that industry is taking something that is an emission that some people want to get rid of, re-injecting that and pulling out the oil and natural gas that powers modern life today. I think that's a great benefit, and it's a reflection on who we are as Texans, is finding opportunities out of problems often, and it's exciting. I now we've kind of gone through the big picture, I think, and our listeners should see the facts about CCS. I want to get a little into the actual process of the storage. And when people might be amazed to hear about the incredible rock formations right underneath our feet, just how many layers of rock are actually key to keeping CO2 trapped underground, and see if you can just break down for a non-geologist like me, and I'm sure not all of our, I'm kind of a shade tree economist, Dr. Bump. I may not have passed your class, because the social sciences that, sometimes, it's, 4 can be 3 or 5 plus or minus 1. I kind of like those kind of conversations, but maybe the science about what geologists can tell us what the subsurface actually looks like, and how those same rocks that have held oil and gas in place for years can store CO2, and how it can be safely locked away.
Be careful what you ask for. I'll talk about this stuff all day. If you've ever stood on the rim of the Grand Canyon, you've actually got a pretty good image for what the subsurface looks like, right? And even if you've just seen a picture, right, there's a lot of layers, right? So the Colorado River cuts, in round numbers, about a mile deep. You get a mile window into the earth with that viewpoint. And there's 3 things that I'd highlight about it. One, there are no giant caves down there, right? It's layers of rock. And we store fluid, whether it's water, oil and gas, or CO2, in the little pores, the openings between sand grains. And if you've ever seen a flower growing in a jar of marbles, this is the same thing. The marbles are like sand grains, and the water or the CO2 or whatever is in the spaces in between, the pore space, as we call it. Second thing I'd say is that there are a lot of layers, right? Each one of those layers you see in the Grand Canyon has different flow properties. So some of them have lots of pores, high porosity as we call them, good connections between the pores, high permeability as we'd call it. They accept fluids readily. They make good storage reservoirs. There are other layers that are just the opposite. The pores are tiny, they're disconnected, they're really difficult to flow fluids through, and they make great seals because of that. Those are the things that keep buoyant fluids in the subsurface. The third thing is just the depth, right? Standing on the rim of the Grand Canyon, the distance, the vertical distance down to the river is about 5,000 feet. You've got a lot of depth. Along the Gulf Coast, we have about 9 miles of rock to play with.
I mean,
9 miles of those layers to play with.
from top to bottom, we're talking about here, not side depth is what, yeah.
Now
Wow.
we've got hundreds of miles side to side.
Yeah.
So typical CO2 storage depths are 5,000 to 8,000 feet. So a mile, mile and a half, maybe 2 miles down. Rim to river in the Grand Canyon is about the minimum depth below surface we'd be storing CO2. So the key point here, we've got a lot of very low permeability layers between CO2 and protected aquifers or even surface that keep CO2 in the ground. And we know they work because, as you said, these are the same layers that have trapped oil and gas for literally tens to hundreds of millions of years.
Well, folks, if you're looking for a vacation this summer, Dr. Alex Bump just gave you an idea to go to the Grand Canyon, and you can educate yourself and enjoy the beauty of this great country all at the same time. And I've never really thought about it in those terms, Alex, about looking at that cutaway as just a sample for normal human beings like me to see what the underground surface actually looks like. And I've got a screensaver that pops up, and you see something growing out of rock, a flower or a tree, and that's interesting to recognize. That's pore space that we're talking about, that it creeped out of, right?
Yeah, you experience the same thing when you go to the beach, right? Loose sand.
Yeah.
You spill your drink on it, the drink disappears. Right? Where is it gone? It's not into the sand. It's into the spaces between sand grains. Same thing.
This is good stuff. I like this. Maybe I should go back to school and get in a new major. I don't know if I'll do that. I don't know if I'll go that far, but I do like thinking and understanding and looking at sandstone like rock layer that acts as a giant sponge that is hundreds of feet thick. And that's where we place the CO2, which has been pressurized, as we discussed, into a fluid-like state. And it's right into those microscopic pores, and it's not into the sand, as you say. It's in that space between the sand. And what I find amazing about this, Alec, is that layers of cap rock that sit on top of that sponge, each cap rock can be hundreds of feet thick, like a skyscraper of solid rock. And it tells us more about the cap rock that seals that CO2 underground, and how geologists use that historical data and test wells to find those ideal spots to store that CO2.
Very much. Those cap rocks or low permeability rocks, they go by several names. Cap rocks is one, because they cap the accumulation in oil and gas, or cap the storage reservoir in CO2. They're also called seals or confining systems. But the commonality is that they all have very minimal capacity for fluid flow. It's literally about the same as a granite countertop, right? Same permeability. And, spill your drink on the granite countertop, it's not soaking in. Wipe it up, whatever. Move on with your life. You can leave it there overnight. It's not going to stain the countertop, right? It's not going to soak through. The layers that we're actually looking at, they're not granite. They're commonly clay-rich muds, sometimes salt, sometimes carbonate. But they have about the same permeability as literally a granite countertop. The thickness varies. Um, Sometimes they are literally skyscraper, even several skyscrapers thick. Sometimes there are a couple of floors in that skyscraper, but usually we have a stack of them. And that's not the thickness that matters, it's the permeability. And with a stack of these layers, with intervening high flow layers, it's like having multiple roofs on your house, right? We know that one roof is enough, it'll keep us dry. But if you had 5 roofs, it wouldn't really matter if you had a tiny hole in one, would it? Same idea. And we can assure these things pretty darn well. We geologists spend a lot of time characterizing these layers, verifying that they'll do the job. And to put that in perspective, it is common for a team of people like me to spend a year or more working on describing these rocks, de-risking the storage site, drilling test wells, characterizing it from all the available seismic well data, analogs, fluid flow modeling, describing these rocks, and assuring that CO2 or whatever will stay where we put it. Our job is to de-risk the investment, to de-risk it from a public safety perspective, and we're pretty good at it.
Well, that's good. Safety is the number one priority of companies in the oil and gas business, and I've been really impressed about the consistency of the need for safety and the emphasis on it. And when you talk about drilling these test wells, so you're going over a large geographic area, sampling and pulling different samples, and then so you make recommendations based on the porosity of those individual samples and where this storage site needs to be. Is that the way that works?
That's part of it. We also have usually an awful lot of historical data, particularly on the Gulf Coast, right? Texas and Louisiana together have about 1 million historical wells on the Gulf Coast. So excluding the Permian Basin, excluding the Panhandle, North Texas, we have about 1 million wells that we can draw on. We also have seismic surveys, basically sonograms of the earth, same technology used for imaging babies, just bigger scale. We've got pictures, 3D pictures of the subsurface across all of the Gulf Coast. So we have all of that. We have the historical oil and gas data. We have a lot to draw on.
1 million wells or 1 million samples. Statistically, that's an amazing large amount of data to help inform you. And I like the fact that we're not just talking about a couple 100 feet down. I think you mentioned 5,000 to 8,000 feet down is kind of a customary space. Folks, from my real estate days, I remember a mile is 5,280 feet, unless I've lost something in my units of measurement over the years. So we're talking a mile or more beneath the surface with multiple stacked roofs or caps on top of that in most instances. And the data shows, I think, I might be wrong on this, and I want you to correct me, but more than 99% that's stored for CO2 for 1,000 years will be there. And we're talking about geology that's already trapped fluids and gases long before civilization.
You are. 99% and 1,000 years are commonly quoted numbers. If I do my job right, it's 100% and it's millions of years. Oil and gas proves it, right? Same buoyant fluids, and they're staying for literally millions of years. One of the ways I work on de-risking the systems is to characterize the statistical distribution of the properties that matter, and then construct models on the worst case. So I can define the statistical permeability distribution, the statistical number of layers, retaining layers in different wells, all of that kind of thing. And I can make models with the most pessimistic versions of those distributions and then try to make them fail, right? Keep injecting. In engineering, this is about defining the safety factor, right? We have our design limit, what we're expecting to, the load that we're expecting to put on, let's say a cable or a hook or a bridge or whatever. In CO2 terms, it's the amount that we're planning to inject. But I can, in model space, over-inject. I can double that volume. I can multiply it by 10. and I do, right? I try to find the limit of these systems. So when I say better than 99%, I mean it. I work a lot on this, and it really is 100%.
Well, we like scientists like you, Alex, who are digging in, pushing these things to the limit because safety is something that local landowners care about. Everyday Texans care about safety, and and that's, as we mentioned, we want to talk a lot about that. Tell us about the extensive evaluation that takes place to identify older abandoned oil and gas wells as part of the process to evaluate potential storage areas. You know, people are reading about these issues in the news. And so this is an important and required step to ensure safety of these storage facilities. How does that play in?
So you're spot on. This is an excellent question because the geologic seals are incredibly robust, as I was describing. The thing we worry about are the shortcuts across them, which are chiefly the old wells. Right? Every old well penetrates those seals and creates a hole in them. So we do a lot of work to assure that they're properly plugged. And it starts with definition of what we call the area of review, which is basically the footprint of the project. It's the footprint of both the CO2 plume and the pressure elevation associated with injection. Within that area of review, we have to identify all of the legacy wells, review their construction and abandonment records, re-enter them where needed to relog them and assure their construction, and if necessary, remediate them to assure their integrity under increasing pressure and exposure to CO2. So there's a lot that goes into this.
Yeah, you're describing really an exhaustive process in order to ensure the safety. And CO2 is really not a volatile product or anything of that nature. So it's not like other products, but still industry is going to a level of thoroughness. I want to enunciate that term very, very clearly, thoroughness, which is a standard of practice for our industry. And I'm so glad to hear you describe these processes about the safety that's a top priority for our operators, both for the safety of their employees as well as the communities in which they operate, and that many of the 500,000 Texans that have a direct paycheck from oil and gas actually live themselves as well. Folks, we're going to take a quick break to hear from this episode's sponsor. And when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about how we actually get these projects off the ground. We're listening to Dr. Alex Bump and TXOGA Talks. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Neil Carlton, president of the TXOGA Insurance Agency. The TXOGA Insurance Agency is pleased to sponsor today's episode of the TXOGA Talks podcast. TXOGA members have access to the TXOGA Safety Group with Texas Mutual and get a premium discount of 12.4%, as well as the possibility to earn 2 dividends. Participants also have access to unique safety tools to keep their team safe and on the job. Visit TXOGAinsurance.com for more information.
And we're back, ladies and gentlemen. We've been talking about the science behind CCS, or carbon capture and storage. We're visiting with Dr. Alex Bump from the UT Austin's Bureau of Economic Geology and the Gulf Coast Carbon Center. We're delighted to have Dr. Bump on our show today, and I'm really enjoying this topic of a science nature because Alex is doing such a great job in explaining it in terms that even I can understand it as an Aggie, and I'm sure my Longhorn friends will nod about that reference pretty easily. But we will have plenty to say on the football field this fall, and hope springs eternal for Aggies, and I'm excited about where we're going. But I don't want to get off track here too much, Alex. So I want to get back to discussing how we make these projects a reality. We've been talking about the safety and the science and what is CCS. And so as a company is developing a CCS project, describe to us what process do they have to go through in order to get and maintain a permit to inject CO2?
So this is not a short answer question, and you're already shortcutting it by skipping the business case and securing the leases, right? Those
Right.
are both significant
Well,
undertakings.
let's do that for just a moment. I mean, in order to inject this, companies have to go to landowners and acquire voluntarily from those landowners the space, and landowners have the opportunity to make money as well of an asset that they probably never knew they had or ever thought about a use for it.
Correct. And even some unusual landowners. So, in Texas, we're familiar with the split between surface land ownership and subsurface mineral rights. And of course, subsurface mineral rights means oil and gas and revenues from oil and gas that accrue to the subsurface mineral owner. In CCS, what we're leasing is the pore space, which belongs to the surface landowner. So surface landowners who do not have subsurface rights actually stand to benefit from this. And you get the same kind of royalties.
That's a great point that I think that I'm glad listeners got to hear, because this is an opportunity for landowners to make revenues that they previously wouldn't have access to, and to just continue to generate the good things in the Texas economy, the jobs that comes along with these investments. So that I'm glad you mentioned that. And so let's assume they have the land leased. They've entered into agreements with these landowners. They've identified their sites. Walk us through the process then. What starts occurring?
So that's in many ways that's where I come in, right? I'm a geologist. The first thing is building the case, right? It's building the case that the geology can accept the CO2 we're planning to inject and that it will retain it. And those are the headlines, right? There's a lot that goes into this. So the permitting for what are called Class 6 wells, CO2 injection wells, is governed under the Clean Water Act, and it is the most stringent of all of the permit, all of the different well classes. So it will mean investment of hundreds of millions of dollars in characterizing the site. And I said earlier, it takes a team 1 to maybe 3 years to fully characterize a site, document it, do the modeling for permit. So we're talking about seismic, either acquiring seismic, shooting new 3D seismic, or leasing old seismic. We're talking about reviewing all of the wells and integrating the well data, usually drilling 1, maybe 2 new wells to retrieve samples, creating a 3D model and flow testing that model, using it, stress testing it effectively to de-risk the performance and the containment. So what goes into the permit, and that's just the internal company work. What you put into the permit is the description of that work, what the subsurface looks like, where you're going to inject, what functions as containment. You put in the modeling to demonstrate performance and safety. There are extensive monitoring plans. So if your project is planned for, say, 30 years, there's 30 years worth of monitoring plans plus post-injection monitoring.
Said post-injection, you mean that the site is closed down, they're no longer injecting carbon dioxide, and there's still responsibilities that extend after injection is over?
Correct. Yes. So the company is still on the hook for performance of this site long after injection is finished. There's a financial assurance piece as well to the permit that requires either letters of credit or some financial guarantee that if it goes wrong, the state isn't on the hook for cleanup. And there's a plan for site closure and post-injection site care, as it's called. So the permit then goes through review that now is taking years. Quite frankly, we might come back to that. But it's an extensive review with a public comment period before there's any license to construct the injection wells, let alone start injecting. Once you start injecting, there's ongoing monitoring, statutory reviews every 5 years of performance and updating of the models. They can happen more often at the discretion of the regulators, But bottom line, this is a serious undertaking.
Well, I want to, if I was a listener, I'd be hitting replay right now over all these things that you just said, because it's hard to almost grasp the gravity of the responsibility that's required on behalf of a company and the oversight to ensure that that company is in compliance with the Clean Water Act and all that goes along with getting a permit. But you said something that really jumped out among all the things. So once a permit is issued and the company is operating, you're telling me there's ongoing monitoring, and there are reviews at least every 5 years or even more frequently if the regulator decides that's necessary?
Correct. Yeah. This is very much not a get your permit and away you go, never to be heard from again. The requirement is ongoing monitoring. And exactly what is a negotiation between the company, the permit applicant, and the regulator.
Mm-hmm.
But it needs to be fit for purpose to assure containment and conformance, as it's called, conformance with your model predictions. So we need to be able to verify that the actual CO2 is behaving as our models predicted.
If behavior is identified that is inconsistent for some strange reasoning, in which then the regulatory agency would require the operator to go back in and find a way to be in compliance.
Correct. So part of the permit, I did warn you that was not a short answer. Part that I didn't talk about is the contingency plans. So should there be, there is obviously a monitoring component to the permit, but there is also planning for what if we detect an anomaly by one or more of our monitoring methods. What happens then? Mm-hmm. So if you do detect that anomaly, that triggers a planned set of responses, which again is a negotiation, and the regulator has the authority to halt injection at any time they deem it appropriate.
Well, I'm so glad we're having this conversation about the multiple safety considerations that are a part of a requirement, including you can't be a fly-by-night company. You have to have financial ability to be responsible for your actions. I think that just says a lot about Texas. It says a lot about the process that is established, that when the EPA granted Texas the authority to issue these types of wells, there's just been an absolute flood of interest in CCS, and alongside this interest, we saw Class 6 well permit applications climb rapidly. And Class 6 wells, folks, is the type of permit and the type of well specifically designed for CCS injection here. And there's Class 2 wells, there's Class 1 wells, because there's industrial waste, there's wastewater, there's all kinds of things that different regulators permit. And so, another confidence level, I guess, Dr. Bump, is that the reality is Texas and America has a lot of experience dealing with handling of product and managing them in a responsible manner. And a few years ago, we were seeing a year's backlog at the federal level for applications to be processed for these Class 6 wells, and forcing these projects to kind of be in a holding pattern. Last year, we were grateful that the EPA granted Texas primacy over Class 6 wells. In Texas, we think we can do things better here. Obviously, the first carbon injection began in Texas in the 70s, as Dr. Bump pointed out. And this granted Texas regulators oversight of storage well permitting. And so moving to the state level oversight will help our projects move forward efficiently with local expertise and a real commitment to safety that you've done a fantastic job of describing and giving us a clear understanding of Texas geology as well. I like to think about it like this, Alex. I think Texans know Texas. And and with the Railroad Commission now in the driver's seat, what it means to me is we can maintain the absolute highest safety standards while also moving at the speed of business rather than at the slow pace of federal bureaucracy.
It's a nice way to put it. To get primacy, that is enforcement authority for the rules, the Railroad Commission had to create rules that were at least as stringent as the federal ones. And of course, they can create more stringent reviews, but the federal ones that they take over from are the floor for what they were allowed to do. And they had to demonstrate the ability to enforce those rules. So the standards are high, right? As you keep emphasizing, and rightly so. They are really high. But I think the real advantage is exactly what you said. It's Texans know Texas. We have a lot of really unique geology, and we know it well.
Well, we like to say Texas is the energy capital of the world. We're the nation's largest producer of oil and gas. If Texas were its own country, we'd be the fourth largest oil producing country in the world and the third largest natural gas producing country in the world. And it's really Texas companies that are going all over the world and taking the technology and the science and the proven methods to deliver oil and gas. And just as your background reflects, that's what enables you to know what's underground, to make certain that carbon capture and storage is done and achieving the highest standards of safety. And so I think about this still as an emerging sector, Alex, and I want to talk directly to listeners who might live in areas like Southeast Texas, places like Beaumont or Port Arthur or the surrounding counties. These communities are the industrial heart of Texas and our nation. They're home to world-class refineries and chemical plants. And people often ask, why Texas? Why is our state at the center of the conversation for this technology? And you alluded to that earlier, but kind of recap that for us now.
Excellent question. I think there are three factors that come into play here. One is the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana is the largest concentration of point source CO2 emissions in the US. As you said, it's the manufacturing, the industrial heart of the country. So there's a lot of emissions to capture, and many of them are pretty easy to capture. Ammonia, LNG, hydrogen. Production of those things all emits nearly pure CO2 streams. So there's not a whole lot of engineering required to capture them. Put a funnel over the vent stack, basically. So factor one, you got a lot of emissions. Second one, I mentioned, it's proven geology. We've got over 100 years of oil and gas production, round numbers, 1 million wells, right? We've got, I'm going to struggle for the number of billions of barrels Texas Gulf Coast has produced over the years.
Yeah.
60 billion or thereabouts comes to mind, something like that, right?
Yeah.
We've got, an incredible amount of subsurface data, literally hundreds of proven reservoirs and seals. So there's some absolutely low-hanging fruit here. And the third thing is the business-friendly environment that's used to subsurface and used to dealing with subsurface. We have an amazing workforce. The global heart of the oil and gas industry, there are a lot of geoscientists around. We know Texas, we know Louisiana, we know how to do this. And we have a lot of industrial capability behind us. So, that's kind of why Texas.
Well, that's a great, those are great reasons. And it makes me think we entertain delegations from other countries who have oil and gas and they want to develop those assets, and they come to us at the Texas Oil and Gas Association. So how can we do this? And I tell them, talk to Texans, talk to the Texas Railroad Commission. We have a robust regulatory process that's science-based. We have scientists and engineers like yourself who have had a lifelong dedication to this industry, and we just know how to do things right. And I'm glad that Texas has the geology here to lead in this space, and for all Texans to benefit from the enhanced economic opportunities. And so, let's walk through this, if you can. When a company comes to build a CCS project, what does that actually mean for the local economy? What can they expect in the near term, and how will this benefit them in the long term?
Good question. Before I answer it, I'll actually pick up on something you said slightly earlier there, which is, people coming from around the world to Texas to say, how do we do this, right? Whether it's oil and gas production or CCS. right? There's an incredible export industry in knowledge and in building this around the world. So whether you're in Texas or whether you're somewhere else in the world, what does it mean when a CCS project comes to town? Which is a good question as well. I would say it depends on which part of the project your town has, because emissions are often separated from the location of storage, which means the capture is happening in one place and the storage is happening somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're in the community with emissions and you're looking at constructing a capture project, it's actually similar to constructing a new product line in a refinery, right? So it's a huge industrial construction project, right? Not quite refinery scale. It's a piece of a refinery.
Mm-hmm.
But you're looking at construction that will employ thousands for a period of, let's say, 1, 2, 3 years, something like that. And then operations that will go on for decades, employing, say, tens of people to keep that running. If you're in the storage community, on the other hand, it looks a lot like drilling an oil well, right? There's an ops phase, operational phase with drilling rigs and drill crews. And then decades of quiet with, a wellhead quietly sitting there in the field while the cows graze around it. There's passive monitoring, periodic site visits, royalty checks, and tax payments. And, probably some benefit, well, definitely some benefit to the local community. Very often it's training and new equipment for first responders or upgrades to local roads. Sometimes training programs for local high schools, looking to create new opportunities for kids, which I tell you, growing up in Vermont, I have a rural Vermont on a beef cattle farm. I have a lot of sympathy for the economic prospects of rural communities and a lot of time to try to bring new opportunity to them. That's close to my heart.
Well, you and I are grew up in different parts of the country, but we certainly have the same affinity to want to see good things happen for rural parts of our states. And certainly rural economic development is something I've been a part of my entire career. I grew up in a town where Alcoa came in and built a process up, and then they closed it because it didn't work. My father worked at a glass factory on ship work for 36 years. And so that closed down when I graduated from college because, glass kind of went out and plastics kind of came in. And so having an opportunity for CCS to come in and bring jobs and investment, all done safely, all with oversight, all with a long regulatory overview, even after injection is no longer occurring. It's just a win-win-win, and the landowners benefit from getting paid for something that they never were using before, the surface owners. So it's really about protecting the jobs we already have, all while building a future where Texas stays on top. Capturing CO2 allows our local plants to make lower carbon products that world markets are demanding today. It's, our Texas Gulf Coast is being built out with the LNG facilities that are huge construction jobs, huge benefits to the local communities, huge benefits to, those that are producing natural gas or owning the royalties, because it's markets that are available because of all the things that are being done in capturing and storing carbon dioxide. And it just makes our products more globally competitive. CCS facilities attract millions, if not billions of dollars in new investment as industries look to build new plants near our CCS capabilities. And if we don't build these infrastructure here, those manufacturing jobs and the investments are going to other states and even other countries. Folks, I want to build Texas. I want Texas to grow. I want the next generation to have even more opportunities than what we've had. And we need to make certain that safety is a priority all along the way. And I'm glad, Alex, that you've been able to deliver that message so effectively today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Any thoughts about economic development, what you're seeing in maybe other states? I know Louisiana is a big competitor for Texas.
So yeah, good question. And I'm a geologist. Geology doesn't stop at the state line.
Right.
So I think in terms of Texas and Louisiana, and I'm afraid I don't have numbers for Texas, but economic development gets to the heart of this. And I was talking to a guy a couple of weeks ago who was talking to me about Louisiana, but he estimated that Louisiana now has $100 billion, 100 billion B, of industrial projects in development, CCS projects, data centers, et cetera, et cetera. But 75% of those, so roughly $75 billion, were contingent on low carbon emissions. And I guarantee you Texas is similar. The interest in CCS, the interest in data centers doesn't stop at the state line either. So, for business, carbon storage offers a new revenue stream and perhaps a premium value product. If you're selling LNG or steel or whatever into Europe, then you either abate the carbon consistent with European standards, or you pay what's called the CBAM, the cross-border adjustment mechanism, or it's basically a carbon tax. The US actually leads the world in CCS and CO2 EOR, largely because of entrepreneurial spirit in CO2 EOR and because of DOE support for decades of research in CCS, research and pilot projects. We've done more than any other nation. So we have, as you say, the chance to build a new industry, both here and abroad, exporting our expertise. But as you know, China is hungry, Europe is ambitious. We slow down at our peril. So, it's a competitive market, and we stay ahead by being the best and keeping our lead.
Well, it is a competitive world. I mean, what was it? Thomas Friedman wrote the book "The World Is Flat" a few years ago. I think I'm getting my statistics right here, or my memory right, on one passage that really stuck out to me. He talked about when we were growing up, we were taught to clean our plates because children in China and India are hungry. He said he teaches his kids to do your homework because children in China and India are hungry for your jobs. And so that's really what this is about being competitive, about making certain we're delivering products around the globe. You and I both have an ag background. The beef industry today is a lot better because we sell U.S. beef all across the globe. Our poultry industry, our cotton industry, we export products to markets all across the globe. We do that with oil and natural gas. And so having CCS in Texas and in America opens global markets to U.S. products. And I still remember the statistic from being an ag commissioner in Texas that 95 to 96 of the world consumers live outside the borders of the United States of America. And so if we want to be competitive and we want to grow, we will do things and do them right. And I'm so glad to have had this conversation with you. I'm running out of time, I know, and I want to wrap up and let you go back, Alex, to do what you need to do. But let's close with this. Let me ask you this: if we look 10 years into the future, and Texas successfully establishes itself as the global capital for carbon capture and storage, what does success look like? How does that change the landscape for everyday Texans?
That's a good question. I would say success is a new industry with a new wave of jobs, new revenue. We now have, as I said, about 1 million wells on the Gulf Coast, including about 20,000 disposal wells for saltwater, for industrial waste. CCS rather, will add a few hundred to that total. So it's a tiny fraction. And unless you're looking for them, you're not going to notice. But our schools are funded in part by revenue from state lands, historically oil and gas revenue. This will add billions to that fund, largely through sequestration in state waters, or in the geology way underneath state waters. There will also be some new job opportunities. So your kids graduating college, looking for a new job, may find employment here.
Every parent wants their child to have a job. And so creating more of them creates more opportunities for every Texan. Dr. Alex Bump, ladies and gentlemen, has been our guest today. Alex, thanks so much for joining us and helping us make sense of what's happening beneath the surface, an area that you studied your entire career. Your insights show that the same engineering talent that made Texas an energy powerhouse is the exact same talent that will lead us into this very next chapter. To our listeners, thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of TXOGA Talks, where energy meets insight.
The views expressed on this podcast are not intended and should not be construed to be the views of any particular TXOGA member or company. The purpose of this podcast is to engage in candid conversations about energy needs, energy security, and the future of energy.